Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe McCoy, and I'm an alcoholic. And I've been sober ever since I could remember. And it's truly by God's grace and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I found in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous that I'm sober this morning, and for that I'm very, very thankful. And that's been since November the 3rd, 1973. Somebody's asked me that. And it's good to be here this morning and good to be in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I want to tell you a little story about three guys about like Ralph and Charlie and I. They were all in the 6th grade. They were about 18, 19 years old. Think about that. And the principal wanted them out of the 6th grade desperately. So he called them in the office one day and said, "Boys, I'm going to ask you all the questions. If you get the answer right, you can go into the 7th grade. So they asked Ralph, what is it that women have two of that men like to get their hands on? And he thought for a long time, and he said, well, women have two hands. Men like to hold women's hands. He said, that's good, Ralph. You're in the 7th grade. So they asked Charlie, Charlie, what is it that men have one of that women like to get their hands on? And he thought for a long time, and he said, well, men have one billfold. Women like to get their hands on a man's billfold. He said, that's good, Charlie. You're in the 7th grade. He looked at me and said, now, Joe, I'm going to ask you a simple question. I said, God, I hope so. I missed those first two.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Charlie Parman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink for 9,096 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. Isn't it great to be alive on Saturday morning, know where you are? Yeah. It's great to be alive on Saturday morning, know where your car is. One of the many, many side benefits of being able to stay sober for a period of time. We spent a lot of time yesterday evening talking about what the problem is. We went into the doctor's opinion, and there we were able to see the physical allergy of the body, that thing that ensures that every time we take a drink that it develops the phenomenon of craving, and that craving is so strong that we're unable to control the amount we take after we've once started. And because of that physical allergy of the body, we can no longer safely drink alcohol. We also found that even though that physical allergy of the body was extremely important for us to know about, and even though that explains why the many, many attempts we've made to drink in the last several years of our drinking have always failed, we find that it's important to know that, but really that is not the major problem. Because our physical allergy could not hurt us, the phenomenon of craving could not develop, we could not end up drunk and sick and in all kinds of trouble if we did not take the first drink. And our book is going to tell us as we progress through it over and over that the real problem centers in the mind telling us we can drink rather than in the body that ensures that we can't drink. And we talked about the fact that we had developed what is referred to as a mental obsession of the mind. The idea that we can drink is so strong that it overcomes all ideas to the contrary, and sooner or later, left on our own resources, our mind always goes back and tells us it's okay to drink, and believing that alcohol is going to be all right this time, thinking only about the great sense of ease and comfort that comes with the first couple of drinks, we take those first two drinks. And sure enough, that probably does give us that great sense of ease and comfort, that great exciting in-control feeling. But then those two drinks trigger that allergy, and then we can't stop and we end up drunk all over again. So we can't successfully drink because of the body, and we can't stay sober because of the mind, and we have become absolutely powerless over alcohol. And as we talked about that, if we could find a way to live where we could be sober and peaceful and happy and free, where we could be sober and not be filled with restlessness and irritability and discontent, not be filled with shame, fear, guilt, and remorse, then maybe we could find a way to live where we could be sober and have that sense of ease and comfort without having to take a drink in order to get it. And if we can do that, then of course we don't need to drink alcohol. And as we talked about that, we said that is actually recovery, and we kind of separated the idea of sobriety and the idea of recovery. Lots and lots of people in AA today may be sober, but they're still restless, irritable, and discontented. and they're still filled with shame, fear, guilt, and remorse. And we call that more or less dry sobriety. And they're staying sober on meetings only and guts and willpower. And sooner or later, one or two things will happen to them. Trying to feel better, wanting to feel better, sooner or later the mind's going to tell them it's okay to drink. And they end up drunk, or for some reason they see the need to really get into the program, and they begin to work the program. And then, of course, they get what we call emotional sobriety, which really is recovery from that hopeless condition of the mind and of the body. Now, a good textbook will never tell you anything, but what it doesn't always back it up with additional information. And if you and I were going to medical school, perhaps, and they had taught us about alcoholism in the classroom, about the next thing they would do with us is take us out on the ward in the hospital somewhere and show us an example of one who had alcoholism or who has alcoholism. And our big book's going to do the same thing for us. This morning we're going to start looking at Bill's story. And in Bill's story we're going to see a classic example of what Dr. Silkworth described in The Doctor's Opinion. We're going to be able to see Bill's physical allergy. We're going to be able to see his obsession of the mind. We're going to be able to see him progress from fun and exciting drinking to drinking because of necessity. And then we're going to see him finally drinking for the sickest reason of all, absolute, complete oblivion. And then we're going to see Bill recover from alcoholism. Now, to really understand where Bill's story fits in the book, we have to almost put our minds back into that 1930s period of time before the big book was written. And before the big book was written, they would do with a newcomer what Bill did with Dr. Bob, and then what Bill and Bob did with Bill Dotson. They would go to the newcomer and telling their own story, talking about their own physical allergy, their own obsession of the mind. They would help the newcomer see himself through listening to their story. If the newcomer identified with them, immediately the newcomer could see his own physical allergy and his own obsession of the mind. And then they would say, do you mind if we come back in a day or two? And a day or two later, they would come back and they would begin to talk about the solution to that problem. And they would begin to talk about the power greater than themselves and how they found it necessary to apply that in their lives. And sure enough, they helped the newcomer come to believe that a power greater than himself could restore him to sanity. Again, one drunk talking to another. And then after the person got out of the hospital or the jailhouse or wherever it might be, they would invite them to an Oxford group meeting. And they would bring them into the Oxford group and say, we've been talking to this guy, and we think he knows he's alcoholic, and we think he believes in a power greater than himself, and we want to sponsor him into this group. That's what sponsorship was originally. And then the group would decide whether or not to take him. And then after the group decided to take him in, 4 or 5 of the older members would get with him. They would all get down on their knees, and he would make his surrender. Now, the Oxford group first step is our third step today. And after he made his surrender, then they would all vote on how well he surrendered. And he might have to go back and do that again. But the point of that is that all the information you and I know today for steps 1 and 2, that was given to the newcomer outside of the Oxford group meeting. The Oxford group program started with step 3, or what they call surrender. Now, Bill knew, though, when the book was written, that the first person in Minnesota, they couldn't come to them and talk to them on a one-on-one basis. The book had to be complete enough to do the whole job. Now, Bill's story is a classic example of what they call a visit in the Oxford groups, what we would call today a 12-step call. One drunk talking to another, helping the newcomer see what his problem is, and helping the newcomer come to believe. And I think if we'll look at Bill's story in that light, looking for the identification, one alcoholic to another, we can see exactly where it fits in the book. And I think all of us will be able to identify with Bill. Young or old, man or woman, rich or poor, there are certain characteristics that all we alcoholics have. And if we look for them in another alcoholic, we'll most certainly see them. And as we go through Bill's story, we'll look for identification. Joe?
Let's go to page 2 and we'll begin to talk about Bill. Charlie mentioned it last night that Bill was a real alcoholic just like us. We in Alcoholics Anonymous tend to set Bill and Bob up on a pedestal, and I don't think they would really like for us to do that, but we do it anyhow. But we have to realize that Bill Wilson was a human being just like us. And it's good to identify with another human being, and that's the purpose of this story, and Bill's story is for identification. Bill was just like so many of us. He was a very optimistic person, had a really good outlook on life. Bill was a very hard-working individual. And I couldn't identify with Bill when I first started reading his book because he was an old man, I thought. But as the years that went by, I've learned that I can identify with Bill in many, many ways. He was a very hard-working individual. He was a self-made man. He did a lot of things and became very successful with these ordinary attributes of a human being. And Bill had an awful lot of willpower, too. With this willpower and this desire for hard work, optimistic outlook, and the desire to succeed, Bill became a very successful individual in his own right. And he said on page 2, I took a night law course and obtained employment as an investigator for a surety company. The drive for success was on. I'd proved to the world that I was important.
I already identify with Bill Wilson. That's all I ever wanted to do is just prove to the world that I'm important also. To succeed at something, that seems to be a characteristic of every alcoholic I've ever known.
He said, my work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich, but why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potentially alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or to write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wives. I can identify with Bill already. We had long talks when I'd still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceive their best projects when drunk.
I have no trouble identifying with Bill Wilson.
That the most majestic constructions of philosophic thought were so derived. Charlie said last night that we alcoholics make our living selling fast talk to slow-thinking people. Well, Bill's trying to do that here, but he tried to do all that with Lois too, but Lois didn't buy all that stuff. She was a little quicker than he was. By the time I'd completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that one day turned in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Now, living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined that they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements. But my wife and I decided to go anyway. I had developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. He said I discovered many more reasons later on.
The time Bill is referring to is back in the 1920s. The stock market was on a roll. Just about anybody that dealt with stock made money. About all you had to do is buy them. You didn't have to put down very much money to buy them. Hold on to them, let them go up in price, sell them, take your profits, buy some more. And Bill became one of the first real investment counselors on Wall Street. He began to say, look, someday this bubble's going to burst. Sooner or later, we're going to have to start making our decisions based on fact rather than speculation. Now, being a good alcoholic, he went to those that had the money. And he said, I don't have the money to do this. But if you guys will back me financially, I'll go out and I'll start visiting these companies. I'll look at the plant, I'll look at the books, I'll examine the whole thing. I'll write up reports on them and send them back into Wall Street. And we'll start making our decisions based on fact. And they said, no, thank you, Bill. We don't need that kind of information. We're making about all the money we need to make anyhow. And again, being a good, stubborn, bull-headed alcoholic, you know how we are when we get an idea. He said, to hell with them. I don't need them anyhow. So he and Lois get together, and he says, we gave up our positions, and off we roared on a motorcycle, the sidecar stuffed with tent blankets, a change of clothes, and 3 huge volumes of financial reference service. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I'd had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. Bill and Lois, riding this motorcycle, living out of the tent, went up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States, and they visited with, and he wrote reports up on 100 of the largest companies at that particular time. He said at the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of a large expense account. As soon as these guys saw these reports, they said, oh, yeah, Bill, this is great information. They put him on the payroll, gave him a large expense account. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. For the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. Now, Bill comes from a little town up in Vermont called East Dorset, had never had anything before in his life to amount to anything. And all of a sudden, here he is on Wall Street. People are beginning to listen to his ideas. The money's rolling in. He's got a good job and a large expense account. And he said, I had arrived. I have no trouble identifying with Bill Wilson. How many of us have done the same kind of things? My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important, exhilarating part in my life. Now, Bill doesn't know he's alcoholic. He just knows that he loves to drink. It's a very exciting thing for him. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. Everyone spending thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair-weather friends. Now, we know that as an alcoholic, his drinking is going to get worse. We have a progressive illness. He said, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friend terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. People began to say to Bill, you're drinking too much. Bill, you're costing us money. Bill, why don't you cut back? Bill, why don't you quit? And Bill did exactly the same thing most of us did. He said, to hell with them. I don't need them anyhow. And he begins to operate now entirely on his own. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. I've always believed everything Bill wrote, but I'm not sure about that last statement. Lois, in some of her writings, has a little bit different view of some of that kind of stuff. Let's go over on page 4, first paragraph.
See, I can identify with Bill Wilson, too, because Bill Wilson made people a lot of money, and I, too, at one time made a lot of people a lot of money. My judgment and ideas was followed to the tune of paper millions for people, too. And I was capable of earning money as Bill was, and he was also capable of losing money, as I did, too. So don't ask me about how to make it. He went just like I did, went down the tube. So Bill's doing real well. He's riding high, money's coming his way, applause. Everything's wonderful for old Bill. But he said on page 4, it said, abruptly in October 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market had closed. The ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XIZ 32. It had been 52 that morning. Well, I was finished, and so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping to the death of towers of high finance. He said, that disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. Bill had a solution for his problem. My friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. Well, so what? Tomorrow was another day. And as I drank, the old fierce determination to win came back.
How many of us have done the same thing? We come out of the jailhouse, a divorce court, the hospital, wherever we might be, low, sad, and depressed, stop off in the bar, have a couple of drinks, and as the whiskey courses through our veins, we say to hell with them. We'll show them. They're not going to treat us that way. And we're off and we're running again. That old fierce determination to win seems to be one of the main characteristics of every alcoholic I've ever known. To really succeed, to show them, to be somebody, an extreme driving force.
He said, next morning I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I'd better go to Canada. We all know that all the money's in Canada, don't we?
Minneapolis or Canada.
Minneapolis or Canada, one or the other. It's not in Oklahoma, I can tell you that. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. No St. Helena for me, but drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. This time we stayed broke. You know, this really got to hurt a guy like Bill, who was a self-made man, optimistic, hardworking, made a lot of money, his ideas, and was followed by the tune of paper millions. People were looking up to Bill, and now Bill's on his way down, and this really got to hurt. He said, we went to live with my wife's parents. He said, I found a job, then lost as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. Mercifully, no one would guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. I become an unwelcome hanger-on to brokerage places where Bill used to hang around and help people make a lot of money. Bill's hanging around there now. He's not welcome anymore. The people who own the brokerage house said, Bill, you're coming down here drunk. You don't look good for our business. Why don't you just go on down the street and find someplace else to hang around? We don't want you around here. And that's got to hurt a guy like Bill. I mean, really got to hurt him deep down inside.
Now then we start drinking for an absolutely different effect altogether. Liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. We're not drinking for fun now. We're not drinking for excitement. Now then we're drinking because we absolutely have to in order to survive. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3 got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by half a dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Remember last night, Dr. Silkworth said we really cannot differentiate the true from the false. To us, what we're doing is normal. We see Bill's life going to hell in a handbasket already. Bill can't see that. He thinks he can still control the situation. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at the low point of 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. Now, that's a story within itself. Bill had put another one of his deals together, and the people that had the money agreed to back him one more time on one condition, that he not drink. And Bill said, don't worry about it. I'm through with that drinking. That'll be no problem whatsoever. And he worked on this thing for really a matter of months. And just before it was to be completed, they're all sitting in a hotel room one night. Somebody passes around a bottle of Applejack. And remember, this is during the Prohibition days. Nearly everything they had was homemade. And this old Applejack went by Bill, and he said, no, thank you, I'm not drinking. It made the circle of the room, and after a while it came back. And the guy next to him said, Bill, this Applejack is called Jersey Lightning, finest Applejack in the world. And Bill's mind said, I've never tasted any Jersey Lightning. And with no more thought than that, he just reached out, got the bottle, took a drink of it, triggered the allergy, and of course he couldn't stop drinking, and he blew the whole deal. Now the importance in that lies within the next statement. He said, I woke up, this had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Bill, for the first time, could differentiate the true from the false. He could really see what alcohol's doing to him. Before then, I'd written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily served this time I met business, and so I did. And Bill did exactly what most of us did. He trotted out his willpower, and he said, sick 'em, Will, we're through with that drinking. We'll never take another drink as long as we live. You know, people tell us we're weak-willed people. Don't you believe that? We are strong-willed people. Weak-willed people do not become alcoholic. Third time they vomit, they quit drinking. The alcoholic knows there's got to be a way to drink without puking. We damn near kill ourselves trying to find each other. We are strong-willed people. Bill was strong-willed, self-made man. He'd always been able to do anything he wanted to do on his own will. So he assumes, now that I'm ready, all I have to do is use my willpower and quit drinking. Let's see where he goes from here.
He said, shortly after I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? Where had been my willpower? He said, I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way, and I'd taken it. Was I crazy? See, if willpower doesn't work, then you begin to question your sanity. And Bill now is beginning to question his sanity. And he doesn't know what we know. He doesn't know that any time there's a battle going on between the willpower and the obsession of the mind, that the obsession of the mind will win over the willpower every time. And he doesn't know that yet. So he begins to question his sanity. Am I just crazy? Is that the problem? He said, I begin to wonder for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. So renewing my resolve, pulling out his willpower, he said, I tried again. Some time passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. He said, I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time. But I might as well get good and drunk then, and I did. He said, the remorse and horror and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. He said, my brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. And see, I can identify with Bill there because my mind raced uncontrollably for a number of years prior to coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again, but so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? You know, if willpower doesn't work, then you begin to question your sanity. Then you begin to think about killing yourself and doing away with yourself, and this is what Bill is doing. He said, no, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that, so 2 bottles in oblivion, and now Bill is drinking for the sickest effect of all, total oblivion. He just wants out of it. He just can't seem to cope with it any longer.
The mind and body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again I swayed dizzily before an open window of the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window, sash and all. Somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor lest I suddenly leap. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. Next day found me drinking both gin and sedative, and this combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity, so did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. Now we see Bill approaching the end of this particular drinking bout he's in. We see him beginning to really starting to die from malnutrition. Unless he got some help pretty soon, Bill probably wouldn't be around us. Surely we've been able to see the progression. He went from exciting drinking to where alcohol was becoming more important, finally to necessity drinking, finally to oblivion, and now about all he can do is just drink and pass out and drink and pass out. He said, my brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness of that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I'd been seriously ill bodily and mentally. Now, this is when Bill went into the town's hospital in the summer of 1933, and Dr. Silkworth withdrew him from alcohol. The belladonna treatment, that was a drug that was a member of the nightshade family, and it was used to fool the body into thinking it had alcohol in it. And it was used for withdrawal purposes. Today they use Valium for the same purpose. Hydrotherapy, we saw some of that over in Australia. That's where they strap you down on a gurney, take you into a shower room, and you got shower heads all the way around the room. They alternate hot and cold water on you. Doesn't cure alcoholism, but it makes a clean drunk out of you, I'll guarantee you that. Bill said it relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. When Dr. Silkworth explained to him this mental obsession of the mind, that explained to Bill why his willpower would not work. My incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop is explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months the goose hung high. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. Let's see where he goes on self-knowledge.
But it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time, I returned to the hospital. That was the second trip in 1934. This was the finish of the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. You know, Bill was in the hospital room, laying in the bed, and Dr. Silkworth was telling Lois this outside of his room. He said, Lois, I don't know what's going to happen to Bill, but it looks to me like that he's going to end up with a wet brain during delirium tremens, or we're going to have to lock him up in an asylum for his own protection and for your protection. Now, Bill overheard this. They didn't tell Bill. Dr. Silkworth was telling Lois. He said, they did not need to tell me. He said, I knew and almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. Who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was plunged into the dark, joining those endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. Bill was about to give up. He was totally hopeless. You know, Bill was full of a lot of hope and optimism, but now he is hopeless. He is without hope. And we all know that we can't live but about 5 seconds without hope. And this is where Bill is right now. He's totally hopeless, without hope.
Let's look at this next statement very carefully. He said, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. I've never seen a better description of step one. No step one written in those days. But this is where Bill certainly took it. This is where he admitted complete defeat. Alcohol was his master. Now, he knew the problem. He got that from Dr. Silkworth in 1933. Here we are now in the middle of 1934, and we see him taking what we know today as step one. Now, if that should happen to you and I today, chances are we would say, well, I guess I better go to AA. But Bill didn't have any AA to go to. He's in the best facility he knows of, and the only thing he can do, even though he's admitted complete defeat, is to leave there and try to stay sober on his own resources. He said, trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. And on Armistice Day, 1934, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted in what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Near the end of that bleak November, and I imagine it was a pretty bleak November, he started drinking on November the 11th. We're approaching the end of November now. We've been drunk for almost 3 weeks. I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of her bed. I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. Now, this is the old school friend, the guy named Ebby Thatcher. And Ebby comes over to visit with Bill in Bill's kitchen.
You know, Ebby's family was a very prominent family in Albany, New York. As a matter of fact, Ebby's father was the mayor of Albany at one time. And during this time, Ebby was a black sheep of the family, always running around getting drunk and getting in trouble of all kinds. So they wanted to get Ebby out of town and get him away from Albany so they wouldn't make him look bad. So they told Ebby, said, Ebby, we have this summer place over in Vermont. We want you to go over there and get sober and don't come back until you do. Just get him out of town. That's the way they did with alcoholics at that time. And they said, we have that summer place over there and it needs fixing up, painting up, fixing up. While you're over there sobering up, you might as well fix up the summer place. So he went over there, and naturally he started drinking, and he was working, fixing up the summer place. And one day he finished painting the wall, the outside of the wall of the house, and he was admiring that. And he noticed the pigeons were sitting on the side of the wall there and doing some things on his new freshly painted wall that he didn't like. So he went in the house and got the shotgun and began to shoot at the pigeons, blowing holes in the side of the wall. Well, the neighbors, they don't like that at all, so they call the police. And they come and get Ebby, and they take Ebby to jail. And eventually they take him before this judge, and the courts were going to have him committed for alcoholic insanity. That's what they could do for alcoholics at that time. Almost anybody could have you committed for alcoholic insanity. Your wife, the police, or just interested neighbors could have you done. We were fair game, in other words, what I'm trying to say. So that's what they were going to do with Ebby. But fortunately for Ebby, 2 men interceded on his behalf, a guy named Roland Hazard and Zebra Graves. They interceded on Ebby's behalf, and they talked to the judge. They said, Judge, if you will release Ebby to our care, we have a group here called the Oxford Groups. And we have a program in the Oxford Group that if this man will come to the Oxford Group and try this program, then we think we can help him overcome his problem. Well, the judge didn't want to send Ebby to jail any more than they want to do that today. So they released Ebby to Zebra Graves and to Roland Hazard, and they took him to the Oxford Groups, and Ebby began to go to the Oxford Group and began to practice the principles or the tenets of the Oxford Groups, and he got sober. And a couple of months or 3 later, he moves back to New York, and he starts staying at the Calvary Mission. And while at the Calvary Mission, which is the headquarters of the Oxford Group in New York City, he remembered his friend Bill. And he said, I think I'll go over and help Bill with his problem and maybe tell Bill a little bit about myself and what's happened to me.
Now, Bill didn't know any of this stuff. Last he had heard, they were going to put Ebby in the nut house. He said, I wondered how he had escaped. Of course, he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we'd chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility, the very thing an oasis. Drinkers are like that. Now, the story goes that Bill had heard and knew that Ebby had some stomach problems, and he knew that this bathtub gin that he had would probably tear Ebby's stomach up. So Bill looked around there in the house, and he finally found some pineapple juice. And he took pineapple juice and bathtub gin, mixed it up in a bowl, set it down on the kitchen table, waiting for Ebby to get there. And when Ebby gets there, we're going to have a few drinks, we're going to rehash old times, and we're really going to enjoy it. The door opened, and he stood there fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different what had happened. I pushed a drink across the table, and he refused it. Disappointed but curious, I wondered what got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me. Simply but smilingly, he said, I've got religion. Now, I'm damn glad that didn't happen in my kitchen. I have no idea what I would have done. But here's what Bill did. He said I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little crack about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire all right, but bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea,
which is step 2,
and a practical program of action,
which is steps 3 through 12.
That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. Now then, Bill knows all 3 things. He got the problem from Dr. Silkworth back in the summer of 1933. But we can see self-knowledge didn't fix him. Now then, we're in the early part of December of 1934, and Ebby brings him the other 2 pieces of the puzzle. The solution referred to here as a simple religious idea, which is the vital spiritual experience, and the practical program of action necessary to find it. Let's see what Bill does with this information.
He said he'd come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. He said, I was shocked but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. See, Bill had already took step 1, totally admitting that he was hopeless. And here's a friend of his, Ebby, who is bringing him a solution. And it wasn't a solution that Bill liked at all. He was aghast at this solution. He was shocked, but he was interested. He had to be, for he was hopeless.
Bill's father left him as a young boy and went up into Canada, never did come back. Bill's mother went to New York City and took Bill's sister. And she went there to learn to become an osteopathic doctor. And that left Bill in Vermont by himself with his grandma and grandpa. And he was raised basically by Grandpa Griffith. Now, Grandpa Griffith had some ideas about religion that he transferred and passed on to Bill. His grandpa didn't believe in religion. He believed in spirituality, but he didn't believe in anybody telling anybody else how they must believe. And he passed this knowledge on to Bill. Now, Ebby's sitting here coming out of the Oxford groups. And the Oxford groupers were a group of people practicing first century Christianity to the best of their ability, and most of their terms were highly religious in nature. And as Ebby began to talk to Bill about these ideas, Bill absolutely rebelled almost immediately. I have no trouble identifying with Bill Wilson. Let's see what he thought about this.
So on page 10, Bill is somewhere between steps 1, which we know that he took, and step 2. He's beginning to question this solution, as we all do. Now, he talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on those still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that pauper temperance pledge I never signed. My grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings. His insistence that the spirits really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. He said these recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. That wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back again. He said, I'd always believed in a power greater than myself. I'd often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are. For that means blind faith in the strange proposition that the universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. How could there be so much precise and immutable law and no intelligence? Well, I simply had to believe in the spirit of the universe who neither knew the time nor limitation, but that was as far as I'd gone. With ministers in the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. He was saying there's got to be a harder way to do this than that. I mean, there's got to be.
He said, to Christ I considered the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him, his moral teaching most excellent. For myself, I'd adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. For some reason, I don't have any trouble identifying with Bill Wilson. How many of we alcoholics have the same kind of feelings about God, about religion, and etc.? Page 11, third paragraph. But my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at that minute. This is where the identification process is so important. Bill knew Ebby, and he knew about Ebby, and he knew how Ebby drank. And he knew that if Ebby was staying sober, some power greater than Ebby had to be working in Ebby's life. Now, whether Bill likes it or not is beside the point. Ebby's sitting there, living proof of some power working in his life. Let's go over to page 12, first paragraph.
He said, but despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still arouses a certain antipathy. When a thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. He said, I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of the czar of the heavens, however loving his way might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God?
I can almost see these two guys sitting there in that kitchen. Bill's drinking, been drinking now for about 3 weeks. Ebby's sober, and they're talking about God. You know how we are when we get into those kind of conversations. And Bill's wanting to call him universal mind, spirit of nature, or whatever. Ebby's calling him God. And I guess finally Ebby got tired of it. And he said to Bill, why don't you just choose your own conception of God? And the instant he said that, his message changed from a religious message to a spiritual message. Religion says this is the way you have to believe. Spirituality says it doesn't make any difference how you believe. The main thing is, are you willing to believe? Now then, we're not dealing with religion. We're now dealing with spirituality. And let's see the effect that this had on Bill. He said, that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I'd lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. Surely this is when Bill took step 2. No step 2 written in those days. But here is where Bill came to believe that a power greater than himself could help him out. And he came to believe that based on one simple little statement. Why don't you choose your own conception of God? And that statement has opened the door for literally millions of we alcoholics to be able to start seeking and finding the spiritual help necessary to recover based on old ideas. We never would have been able to do this. This is a brand new, completely new idea that you can choose your own conception of God. Now, another thing we need to point out, he says, upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. As we go through the book, Bill is going to be talking about a wonderfully effective spiritual structure that we're going to build. And we're going to pass through that structure to freedom. And eventually he'll tell us what that structure is. His first reference is, upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Actually, step 1 brings the willingness. When we've admitted we're powerless over alcohol, that what we're doing is no longer going to work, then we become willing to open our mind to some new ideas. Later on, we're going to see where step 2 is the cornerstone, and then as we progress through, he'll add more stones in place. The first reference, step 1, willingness is the foundation, and then believing, step 2, we'll see later will be the cornerstone. Bill has now taken steps 1 and 2. No steps like that written in those days, but certainly we see Bill taking them. Ebby immediately starts taking him to Oxford group meetings. But remember, Bill's drunk, and he started drinking on Armistice Day, and he can't get sober. Finally, he has to go back into the town's hospital now for the 3rd trip on page 13. He said, at the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. Dr. Silkworth withdraws him from alcohol. Ebby comes to visit with him, and they begin to apply this little practical program of action from the Oxford groups in Bill's life. Let's see what takes place here.
He said, there I humbly offer myself to God as I then understood him to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost.
Now surely that's what we know today is step 3. Their first step was surrender, and Bill later changed that to make a decision. So we see him taking there in the hospital step 3.
He said, I ruthlessly faced my sins.
They had a tenet or a step or a principle, whatever you want to call it, that said examine your sins. And Bill knew no self-respecting alcoholic's ever going to do that. So later he changed that to make a searching, fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Now then, Bill's dealing with step 4.
And I became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch. I have not had a drink since.
Became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch. That statement later became steps 6 and 7, where we became ready to have God remove these defects of character, and in step 7 humbly ask him to do so. Another thing you'll notice, became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch, friend is capitalized. Bill used many, many words in the big book for God. But every time he mentions God, whatever the word might be, he will capitalize that word. Friend here, he's referring to God.
My schoolmate visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies.
Now we see him taking what we know today as step 5. They're in the town's hospital with Eddie.
We made a list of people I had hurt and toward whom I felt resentment. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability.
And certainly here we can see steps 8 and 9.
I was to test my new thinking by the new God conscious within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense.
That statement later became step 10, where we continue to take personal inventory.
I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore on my usefulness to others. Then only might I expect to receive, but that would be in great measure.
That's got to be step 11, where we sought through prayer and meditation, so on, so on, so on, and so forth.
My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator, that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems.
And surely that is the first part of step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps.
Belief in the power of God, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. It was simple, but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness, and I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. Poor old alcoholics got to give up the two most important things in our lives. One is our alcohol, and the other is our self-centeredness.
Very simple idea, but extremely hard to do. Now, as we see Bill practicing those tenets, Oxford group tenets in that hospital to the best of his ability, let's see what takes place. He said these were revolutionary and drastic proposals. At the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I'd never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. Now, Bill thought he was going crazy. He said, for a moment I was alarmed and called my friend the doctor to ask if I were still sane. And he listened in wonder as I talked. Finally, he shook his head, saying, something has happened to you I don't understand, but you'd better hang on to it. Anything is better than the way you were. Now, we don't know what happened to Bill that day because we were not there to see that. But we do know this was probably about December the 12th or 13th of 1934. Bill didn't die until January of 1971. It was never necessary for him to take a drink of alcohol for the rest of his life from this day on. Something profound took place that day. Bill always said, I had a spiritual experience in the town's hospital as the result of these steps. This is why later on, when he wrote chapter 5, he was able to say, these are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. Bill took them in the town's hospital to the best of his ability. Now, I think here another great miracle takes place. Ebby left, and he came back a day or two later, and he handed Bill a book. He said, Bill, here's a book you might be interested in. He said, I haven't read it, but I think you might want it or might like it. And he handed Bill a book called The Variety of Religious Experiences by William James. And as Bill read through that book, he found an experience in there just exactly like his, validated for him that he had had a vital spiritual experience. Now, I think the miracle is this. I've got that book at home today in my library, and I've been sober almost 25 years, and I can't read the damn thing today. It's written in a language that I simply do not understand the words that are used. Bill found himself in there in about 2 or 3 days of sobriety. Absolute miracle, I think, took place, validated the idea of the vital spiritual experience.
You know, this vital spiritual experience is the solution to alcoholism. That is the answer. You know, but that's not all there is to it. Because Bill goes on to say, and I know that that's a goal. It's a goal in Alcoholics Anonymous to have this spiritual experience. But then it says in the last paragraph on page 14, my friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. Particularly was it imperative to work with others that he'd worked with me. Faith without works was dead, he said, and how appallingly true for the alcoholic. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. And if he did not work, he would surely drink again. And if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed. With us, it's just like that. He said, my wife and I abandoned ourselves with enthusiasm to the idea of helping other alcoholics to a solution to their problems. It was fortunate for my old business associates remained skeptical for a year and a half, during which I found a little work. I was not too well at the time, was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. This time sometimes nearly drove me back to drink. But I soon found when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. Many times I've gone to my old hospital in despair. On talking to a man there, I would be amazingly lifted up and set on my feet. It's a design for a living that works in rough going.
You know, this is why Bill, immediately after leaving a town's hospital, began trying to work with other alcoholics. Didn't help any, but made him feel better. Then in Akron, he was just about to get drunk. And he remembered how back in New York City, even though he'd never helped anybody, he had felt better. So he made contact with Dr. Bob. Not to sober up Dr. Bob, but to keep Bill Wilson from getting drunk. Work with another seems to always lift us up out of whatever mess we're in. Always makes us feel better.
You know, this program, it's a design for living that works. And we have took a design for living and turned it into a non-drinking society, unfortunately. This is a design for living. And we measure our success by the number of days, weeks, months, or years in which we are not drinking. And that's the wrong measure, I think. It's a design for living. That, you know, trying to help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety and having a conscious contact with God to be a maximum service to God and the people around us. That's the measure, I believe, of success in Alcoholics Anonymous. And we don't have to be sober very long in order to do that. It's a quality of living, a design for living. That's what we're really talking about in Alcoholics Anonymous.